a land of rice, rivers, and centuries-old people. A place where empires met and resistance was forged. But in the decades after World War II, the stakes changed. What began as an anti-colonial struggle became a proxy battleground of the Cold War, and drew a reluctant superpower into a conflict few in Washington truly understood. This is the story of how the Vietnam War began. To understand Vietnam after 1945, start with the long shadow of empire. France ruled Indochina, Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia for nearly a century. Colonial rule reshaped the economy, created social divisions and seeded nationalist movements. In World War II, Japan occupied the region, briefly displacing French control and destabilizing old orders. Local resistance networks grew stronger. One emerged with particular force, the Viet Minh. To understand the Vietnam War, we must first look to the world that existed before it, a world shaped by empire, war, and occupation. For nearly a century, Vietnam had lived under French colonial rule, part of the vast territories collectively known as French Indochina, which included present-day Laos and Cambodia. France came to Vietnam in the mid-19th century, seeking to expand its influence, access valuable resources, and compete with other European powers. They established plantations, built railroads, and created administrative centers in cities such as Hanoi, Saigon, and Hue. The colonial system reshaped Vietnamese society. Traditional social structures were disrupted, and economic inequality intensified. The French extracted wealth from the land, profited from rubber plantations, and tightly controlled industry. Meanwhile, the majority of the population, farmers, laborious, and rural villagers, faced poverty, forced labor, and heavy taxes. These conditions would plant the seeds of resistance that would later define the war. During the 1940s, the world underwent seismic shifts. In 1940, France itself fell to Nazi Germany. With the European powers weakened, Japan seized the opportunity to occupy Vietnam, sidelining the French administration while keeping them nominally in power. The Japanese occupation lasted until 1945, during the final months of World War II. Under Japanese rule, Vietnam experienced widespread famine. In northern regions, particularly the Red River Delta, millions of people faced starvation. Some estimates suggest that more than 2 million Vietnamese died from hunger during this period. The suffering created an intense desire for change, a yearning for independence, and a readiness for revolutionary movements. Amid this turmoil, a leader emerged who would shape Vietnam's future, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was no ordinary revolutionary. He had traveled the world, studying political systems in France, working with communist groups in Moscow and China, and returning to Vietnam with a vision of national independence fused with socialist ideals. In 1941, he founded the Viet Minh, short for Vietnam CLP Ng Minh Hai, or the League for the Independence of Vietnam. The organization was designed to resist foreign domination, whether French or Japanese, and unite the Vietnamese people under a common cause. The Viet Minh combined military strategy with grassroots politics. They mobilized villages, recruited young men and women, and organized clandestine education programs. By emphasizing both nationalism and communist ideology, Ho Chi Minh created a movement that appealed to the broader population while maintaining strong ties with international communist powers. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Vietnam was left in a power vacuum. The French, eager to reclaim their colony, returned to Hanoi. But before they could fully establish control, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh acted. On September 2, 1945, in Ba Dinh Square, Hanoi, Ho declared the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He spoke to his people with words that resonated across the globe, quoting the United States Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. The Creator has given us certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and happiness. The declaration was more than symbolic. It was a direct challenge to the returning French and a statement to the international community: Vietnam would no longer accept foreign domination. But the French were not willing to relinquish their empire so easily. Despite the proclamation of independence, they sought to reassert control over their Southeast Asian colony. This clash between Vietnamese nationalist aspirations and European colonial ambition set the stage for the First Indochina War, a conflict that would last nearly a decade and lay the foundation for the larger Vietnam War to come. In the years that followed, Ho Chi Minh's leadership and the Viet Minh's organization would allow a relatively small force to challenge a well-equipped colonial army. They relied on guerrilla tactics, knowledge of the terrain, and the unwavering support of rural communities. The conflict became not just a military struggle, but a battle for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. By the mid-1940s, the world was watching a nation emerge from the shadow of empires. In Vietnam, centuries of colonial exploitation, the devastation of war, and the famine of occupation had produced a single, undeniable truth: the Vietnamese people would fight to determine their own destiny. And so, as the First Indochina War loomed on the horizon, the stage was set. A small but determined revolutionary movement would face the might of France and eventually the attention of the world's superpowers. The fall of empire in Vietnam was not just the end of French colonial rule, it was the beginning of a struggle that would engulf generations, drawing in nations far beyond Southeast Asia. In the ashes of the Second World War, the map of Asia was being redrawn. Old empires crumbled, and new nations began to rise. Yet in Indochina, the past refused to fade away so quietly. When Japan surrendered in 1945, its occupation of Vietnam ended abruptly, leaving a power vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped two opposing forces: the returning French colonial administration and the Vietnamese nationalists of the Viet Minh, led by a thin, quiet revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh. Ho was more than a nationalist. He was a student of global revolution, shaped by decades abroad, from Paris to Moscow, from Boston to Beijing. He believed Vietnam's independence was inevitable, but that freedom would come only through struggle. The French, however, saw Indochina not as a relic of empire, but as a vital part of France's identity. After the humiliation of Nazi occupation, Paris sought to reassert its global influence. To many French leaders, losing Vietnam would mean losing face on the world stage. In late 1945, negotiations began between France and the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh, pragmatic but wary, signed an agreement recognizing Vietnam as a free state within the French Union. It was a fragile peace, one built on mistrust. Beneath the signatures, both sides prepared for the conflict they knew was coming. By December 1946, tensions reached a breaking point in Hanoi. A dispute over customs inspections spiraled into gunfire. The French responded with heavy artillery, shelling Vietnamese neighborhoods. Streets burned, civilians fled, and the city descended into chaos. The First Indochina War had begun. For the next 8 years, the French Expeditionary Corps, roughly 190,000 men at its height, fought against the guerrillas of the Viet Minh, who numbered nearly 500,000 by the war's end. But the two sides were not fighting the same kind of war. France fought conventionally, with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, trying to hold cities, roads, and outposts. The Viet Minh fought from the shadows, ambushing convoys, sabotaging supply lines, and melting into the jungle. To the French, they were elusive and everywhere at once. The war spread across the countryside. French patrols moved cautiously through rice paddies and dense forests, uncertain when the next mine or ambush would come. Villages became battlegrounds. The line between soldier and civilian blurred, as the Viet Minh relied heavily on local support. In remote areas, the Viet Minh built hidden bases, underground hospitals, schools, and training camps, connected by footpaths and tunnels. They fought not just with rifles, but with conviction, a belief that they were liberating their homeland from foreign rule. The French called it La Salgue, the Dirty War. For young conscripts from Paris and Marseille, it was a distant, confusing conflict fought in unbearable heat and constant fear. Morale was low, supplies stretched thin, and the enemy rarely stood still long enough to fight. Meanwhile, the world outside Vietnam was changing. The Cold War was taking shape. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces triumphed in China, giving the Viet Minh a powerful new ally and a direct supply route for weapons and training. In the same year, the United States recognized the French-backed state of Vietnam under Emperor Bao Dai, marking the first steps of American involvement. From then on, Vietnam was no longer just a colonial struggle, it was part of the global contest between East and West. The French received American funding and arms, while the Viet Minh received support from China and the Soviet Union. The conflict became a test of wills between ideologies as much as armies. By 1952, the war had reached a stalemate. French commanders controlled the major cities, Hanoi, Saigon, and Haiphong, but the countryside belonged to the Viet Minh. For every village pacified, another rose in rebellion. French outposts became isolated islands of control in a sea of insurgency. In Paris, public opinion began to shift. The cost of the war was rising, tens of thousands of casualties, billions of francs spent, and little progress made. Many questioned whether Indochina was worth the price. But for Ho Chi Minh and his general, Vo Nguyen Giap, the strategy was clear: endure, outlast, and bleed the French until their will to fight collapsed. Giap, a former history teacher turned military mastermind, believed time itself was Vietnam's greatest weapon. "You can kill 10 of our men," he said, "for every one we kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and we will win." As the war dragged on, both sides committed acts that would scar the nation for generations. Villages suspected of aiding the Viet Minh were burned, prisoners were executed, and propaganda turned neighbors against one another. It was a war of attrition, physical and psychological. By 1953, the French sought a decisive blow to end the conflict. They turned their eyes to a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam, near the Laotian border, a place called Dien Bien Phu. There, they believed, they could lure Giap's army into open battle and crush it once and for all. It was a gamble born of frustration, and it would change the fate of Vietnam forever. After nearly 8 years of war, neither side had achieved total victory. But the French Empire, battered and weary, was beginning to lose its grip. The final act of the First Indochina War was about to begin, and with it, the foundations of the Vietnam War itself were being laid. Next, the thunder of guns in a remote valley, and the moment the balance of power in Southeast Asia shifted forever. In early 1954, deep within the mountains of northwestern Vietnam, a remote valley became the center of the world's attention. A name few had ever heard before would soon echo through history: Dien Bien Phu. To the French command, it was meant to be a bold stroke of strategy, a fortress in the wilderness. A place from which they could cut off Viet Minh supply lines into Laos and force General Giap's army into open battle. To them, it was the key to victory, the end of a long and grinding war. But to the Viet Minh, it was an opportunity, a chance to strike a decisive blow and end nearly a century of colonial domination. In late 1953, French paratroopers dropped into the valley. They dug in quickly, building airstrips, bunkers, and strong points named after women: Beatrice, Gabrielle, Isabel. Commanders boasted that the base was impregnable. Surrounded by hills, equipped with tanks and heavy artillery, and supplied by air, Dien Bien Phu was supposed to draw Giap's forces into a trap. But the French misjudged their enemy. They saw the Viet Minh as guerrillas, light infantry incapable of sustained siege warfare. They did not yet realize that Giap's army had grown into a disciplined, battle-hardened force numbering tens of thousands, supported by Chinese artillery and logistics experts. And above all, they did not understand Giap himself. Vo Nguyen Giap, a former history teacher turned general, was patient, calculating, and ruthless when necessary. He understood that victory in modern war required not just courage, but endurance and logistics. When he saw the French occupy Dien Bien Phu, he recognized its weakness instantly. The base was in a valley, overlooked by steep hills. Whoever controlled those heights would control the battle. Through January and February of 1954, tens of thousands of Viet Minh soldiers, porters, and villagers worked day and night, carving roads through the jungle and dragging artillery pieces up impossible slopes, by hand, bicycle, and sheer determination. Each gun was hidden in caves and camouflaged among the trees. When the French reconnaissance planes passed overhead, they saw nothing. But the hills around the valley had come alive with an invisible army. By March, the French garrison, about 13,000 troops, found themselves encircled by more than 50,000 Viet Minh soldiers. The French commander, Colonel Christian de Castries, remained confident. He believed superior firepower and air support would hold the line. Then, on the night of March 13th, the hills erupted. At precisely 5 p.m., the Viet Minh opened fire with a devastating artillery bombardment. Shells rained down on Strong Point Beatrice, shattering defenses and killing the commanding officer within the first hour. By dawn, Beatrice had fallen. Within 48 hours, Strong Point Gabrielle followed. The French airstrip, their only lifeline, came under constant fire. Supplies could no longer land safely, airdrops missed their targets or were captured by the Viet Minh. Rain turned the valley into a swamp. Shell holes filled with water. Men fought, bled, and died in the mud. From the French trenches, soldiers watched as the hills flashed with muzzle fire, Viet Minh guns that never seemed to stop. Every attempt to counterattack was crushed by accurate, relentless artillery. The once boastful fortress was now a trap, a killing ground from which there was no escape. Inside the bunkers, morale began to crumble. Medical supplies ran out. Stretcher-bearers risked their lives for each wounded man. The smell of cordite and death hung heavy in the air. Radio operators sent desperate messages to Hanoi. "We are holding, but barely." To the north, Giap adjusted his strategy. He abandoned costly frontal assaults and instead tightened the noose, shrinking the French perimeter meter by meter. He was in no hurry. Timing and terrain were his allies. For the Viet Minh soldiers, the battle was hellish but holy, a test of sacrifice for independence. They fought under banners proclaiming determined to fight, determined to win. For many, death at Dien Bien Phu was not an end, but an offering to a future Vietnam freed from foreign rule. By mid-April, the French position was desperate. De Castries requested reinforcements, but none could reach the valley. Every attempt to parachute supplies cost lives. Each passing day, the perimeter shrank. Outposts that once bore romantic names, Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, were now smoldering ruins. The defenders fought bravely. Legionnaires, paratroopers, and colonial troops from North Africa and Indochina held out against impossible odds. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of hope. On May 7th, after 56 days of unrelenting siege, the French fortress finally fell. White flags appeared above shattered bunkers. In silence, the surviving defenders laid down their arms. Out of 13,000 men, more than 10,000 were dead, wounded, or captured. The once proud outpost was nothing but twisted metal and craters filled with rainwater. In the hills above, Viet Minh soldiers raised their red and gold flag, the symbol of a nation reborn. News of the defeat shocked the world. In Paris, the government fell. For France, it was the end of empire in Indochina. Negotiations began in Geneva within weeks of the surrender. There, under the watchful eyes of the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, the great powers divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel, north and south, communist and anti-communist. A temporary measure, they said. Elections would follow. But the elections never came. The victory at Dien Bien Phu was more than military, it was symbolic. A small, colonized nation had defeated a major Western power. It proved that determination, ideology, and patience could overcome the might of empire. And it inspired liberation movements across Asia and Africa for decades to come. Yet for Vietnam, peace was an illusion. The country was now divided in two, and both sides claimed to be the rightful government of all Vietnam. The seeds of the next war, a larger, deadlier, and far more international conflict, had already been sown in the mud of Dien Bien Phu. In the distance, the sound of new engines approached. Not French this time, but American. The war for Vietnam was far from over. It was only changing hands. When the guns finally fell silent at Dien Bien Phu, the war that had shattered a generation of French and Vietnamese soldiers was over. But peace, like victory, would prove elusive. In July 1954, diplomats from around the world gathered in Geneva, Switzerland. Inside a grand hall lined with marble and flags, they met to decide the fate of Indochina. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and quiet mistrust. The Cold War had come to the negotiating table. The Geneva Accords ended nearly a century of French colonial rule. Vietnam would be divided temporarily along the 17th parallel, the demilitarized zone running roughly from the Laotian border to the South China Sea. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh would govern from Hanoi. In the south, a provisional government led by Emperor Bao Dai, and later by a rising politician named Ngo Dinh Diem, would take control in Saigon. It was meant to be a pause, not a partition. The agreement promised nationwide elections within 2 years to reunify the country under a single government. But even before the ink had dried, both sides doubted that promise would ever be kept. In the north, the victory was celebrated as the dawn of independence. Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, pledging land reform, literacy, and equality. portraits of the bearded revolutionary adorned homes and schools. But behind the optimism lay hardship. Years of war had devastated the economy, food was scarce, and social divisions remained deep. The new government embarked on sweeping land reforms, seizing estates from landlords and redistributing them to peasants. Yet these policies often turned violent. Accusations, denunciations, and executions scarred entire villages. For Ho Chi Minh's government, revolutionary zeal sometimes outweighed mercy. In the south, meanwhile, uncertainty reigned. The French withdrew, leaving behind a fragile administration. Into this vacuum stepped NGO Dien Bien Phu, staunch Catholic, fiercely anti-communist, and deeply ambitious. Born to a Mandarin family, Diem saw himself as the moral savior of a divided nation. Backed by his influential brothers and supported by American advisors, he moved quickly to consolidate power. Washington saw Diem as a bulwark against communism. In the logic of the Cold War, the fall of Vietnam might trigger what U.S. officials called the domino effect, the idea that if one nation in Southeast Asia turned communist, others would soon follow. To American policymakers, supporting Diem was not simply about Vietnam, it was about containing Moscow and Beijing. Billions of dollars in aid poured into Saigon. U.S. military advisors arrived to train the fledgling South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN. Roads were repaired, schools rebuilt, propaganda spread through radio and posters promising freedom and democracy. Yet beneath the surface, Diem's rule bred resentment. He favored Catholics in a largely Buddhist country, staffed the government with relatives, and suppressed dissent. Rural peasants, once promised reform, saw little change. And in the countryside, remnants of the Viet Minh who had stayed behind quietly reorganized, forming the seeds of a new insurgency. By 1955, the fragile Peace of Geneva had already begun to unravel. Refusing to hold the promised elections, Diem declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam after a controversial referendum that removed Emperor Bao Dai from power. The North denounced the vote as fraudulent, the South dismissed the North as illegitimate. Two governments now claimed to represent one country. Ho Chi Minh, in Hanoi, announced that unification would come through struggle. Diem, in Saigon, pledged to crush any communist threat within his borders. Vietnam was no longer merely divided by a line on a map, it was divided in heart and ideology. Across the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands, whispers of rebellion grew. Former Viet Minh fighters hid weapons in rice jars, rebuilt underground cells, and began assassinating local officials loyal to Diem. In response, the South Vietnamese government launched brutal crackdowns, imprisoning thousands of suspected communists and dissidents in hastily built camps. Families were torn apart, villages emptied, fear spread like wildfire. In the north, meanwhile, preparations began for what Ho Chi Minh's advisors called the Long Resistance. Factories were moved underground, soldiers trained in guerrilla tactics, and the first supply route south, the earliest trails that would one day form the Ho Chi Minh Trail, were quietly established through Laos and Cambodia. Both sides believed time was on their side. For Diem, the years ahead would bring modernization, stability, and American support. For Ho Chi Minh, patience and ideology would reunite the country. Neither realized that Vietnam was being drawn inexorably toward another, larger war, one that would soon engulf the world's most powerful nation. By 1956, the deadline for national elections came and went. There was no vote, no reunification, only silence and suspicion. The demilitarized zone along the 17th parallel became a symbol of division, two opposing systems staring at each other across minefields and barbed wire. In Saigon, Diem's advisors reassured him that American strength would deter the North. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh's general spoke of patience and preparation. Both men believed history favored them. But history, as ever, would prove indifferent to the hopes of men. For the people of Vietnam, farmers, students, monks, and mothers, the dream of peace had lasted barely a season. Once again, soldiers marched, propaganda blared, and suspicion seeped into every home. The war that had ended French rule had merely changed its face. And as the 1950s gave way to a new decade, American advisors began arriving in greater numbers, unaware that they were stepping into a conflict they would not fully understand, nor easily escape. Next, the advisors become soldiers. And Vietnam, a nation divided, becomes the stage for a new kind of war. By the late 1950s, Vietnam was divided not just by politics, but by destiny. In the north, the red flag of Ho Chi Minh's revolution waved above Hanoi. In the south, Ngo Dinh Diem's regime ruled from Saigon with American blessing. Both claimed to be the rightful government of all Vietnam, and neither intended to yield. The Geneva Accords were supposed to bring peace. Instead, they had built a fragile wall between two rival nations, and behind that wall, pressure was beginning to build. In the south, President Diem faced a growing insurgency he barely understood. In the north, Ho Chi Minh watched patiently, preparing for the next phase of the revolution. Ngo Dinh Diem saw himself as a savior, a man chosen to modernize Vietnam and protect it from communism. But his vision of governance was steeped in rigid hierarchy and Catholic morality. He distrusted the very peasants who formed the backbone of his nation and ruled through family loyalty rather than popular consent. His brother, Ngo Dinh Hu, oversaw the secret police. His sister-in-law, Madame Hu, known as the Dragon Lady, became the glamorous, iron-willed face of the regime, famous for her disdain of political opponents. The Diem family's control reached into every corner of government, from the army to the local villages. To many Vietnamese, Diem's rule felt eerily familiar, just another form of authoritarianism, this time dressed in the language of freedom and democracy. Critics were jailed or disappeared. Newspapers were censored. Monks who protested were watched. And still, American aid continued to flow, convinced that Diem was the only man who could prevent another communist victory in Asia. In Washington, optimism ran high. President Eisenhower's advisors believed that Vietnam could become a model state, proof that democracy could flourish in Southeast Asia. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. Beyond the cities, the countryside simmered with discontent. Peasants saw little of the promised reform. Land ownership remained unequal, corruption was rampant, and government troops often treated rural communities as potential enemies. In this climate of fear and poverty, the remnants of the old Viet Minh quietly began to re-emerge, this time under a new name, the Viet Cong, short for Vietnamese Communists. The insurgency began modestly, a few assassinations, small ambushes, propaganda leaflets scattered by night. But it spread quickly. Village by village, networks of informants, couriers, and guerrilla fighters began to take shape, supported by northern advisors and weapons smuggled along hidden jungle trails. By 1959, Diem's security forces were stretched thin. The government's denounce the communists campaign, meant to root out rebels, only deepened resentment. Thousands were arrested, tortured, or executed, many with little evidence. The repression turned neutrality into resistance. Men who once had no interest in politics took up arms against Saigon. In the same year, Hanoi formally established the Group 559, tasked with building a covert supply route through Laos and Cambodia. It would become one of the most famous logistical networks in modern warfare, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Through dense jungle and treacherous mountains, tens of thousands of porters carried weapons, food, and ammunition southward. The trail was more than a road, it was a lifeline between two Vietnams destined to collide. For the North, it was preparation. For the South, it was a ticking clock. By the dawn of the 1960s, the conflict had escalated beyond Diem's control. In remote provinces, entire districts slipped into Viet Cong hands by night. Local officials feared traveling after dark. Government convoys were ambushed, radios sabotaged, bridges blown apart. The insurgency had become an organized rebellion, one that could not be easily dismissed. The United States responded cautiously at first. President Eisenhower sent additional military advisors. Then, in 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy inherited the problem. To him, Vietnam represented both danger and opportunity. He believed that a limited show of American strength could stabilize the region and prove U.S. resolve to its allies. Under Kennedy, American involvement deepened. Military advisors grew from hundreds to thousands. Helicopters arrived, bringing mobility and firepower to an army unused to either. Special forces, the Green Berets, began training South Vietnamese troops in counterinsurgency. And soon U.S. pilots flew reconnaissance and support missions, the first whispers of a coming storm. In Washington, the reports were confident. Advisors wrote of progress, new schools, and secure villages. But in the jungles of the Mekong Delta, a very different story was unfolding. Government control was crumbling, loyalty was fragile, and the Viet Cong, once a rumor, were now a force that could challenge entire battalions. The Americans viewed the struggle through the lens of the Cold War, democracy versus communism, order versus chaos. But for most Vietnamese, it was not ideology that drove them. It was survival, the choice between two governments, neither of which seemed able to bring peace. By 1962, Vietnam was a nation living in two realities. In Saigon, Diem's ministers spoke of modernization, progress, and victory. In the countryside, families dug trenches behind their homes and whispered of the next raid. The American presence was growing, but so too was uncertainty. Each new advisor sent to help South Vietnam found a country slipping further from control. The lines between ally and enemy blurred as villages changed sides again and again. And yet, the illusion persisted that just a little more aid, a few more troops, a few more helicopters, would be enough to turn the tide. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define the decade ahead, escalation without understanding. By late 1963, the strain became unbearable. Corruption, rebellion, and the persecution of Buddhist monks led to mass protests in Saigon. Images of self-immolation, monks setting themselves aflame in the streets, shocked the world. To Washington, Diem had become a liability. To his people, he had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese generals, with quiet American approval, staged a coup. Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ho were captured and executed. The man once hailed as the savior of Vietnam was gone, his dream of a strong, united South collapsing with him. But his death did not bring peace. It created chaos. Power changed hands again and again, as military officers and politicians fought for control. And through the confusion, the insurgency spread even further. The United States now faced a choice: withdraw and accept defeat, or intervene more deeply to prevent South Vietnam from falling. It was a decision that would soon lead to one of the most consequential chapters in modern history. Next, the storm arrives. American troops land in Vietnam, and a regional conflict becomes a global war. By 1964, the United States had been drawn deep into Vietnam's orbit. For nearly a decade, American advisors, helicopters, and money had tried, and failed, to build a stable South. Now, events in a distant stretch of water would provide the spark that turned advice into war. The Gulf of Tonkin, a quiet expanse of the South China Sea off Vietnam's northern coast. On the night of August 2, 1964, the American destroyer USS Maddox patrolled these waters on a routine intelligence mission. 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached. Shots were fired. Radar screens lit up. The Maddox opened fire, and within minutes, 2 of the enemy boats were damaged, 1 sunk. 2 days later, the Maddox, now joined by another ship, the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack in rough seas and darkness. Radar and sonar readings were confused, visibility poor. Some sailors later questioned whether an attack had even occurred. But in Washington, the incident was presented as clear aggression. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had taken office after Kennedy's assassination, seized the moment. On August 7, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the president to take all necessary measures to repel attacks and prevent further aggression. In reality, it was a blank check for war. Johnson promised restraint. Privately, he told advisers, "We're not going to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." But even as he said the words, the first steps toward escalation were already underway. In early 1965, North Vietnamese forces intensified their campaign in the south. Bombings, ambushes, and political assassination surged. The government in Saigon, now a revolving door of generals and ministers, teetered on the brink of collapse. To Washington, it appeared that only direct American intervention could prevent South Vietnam from falling. The Cold War lens shaped every calculation. Johnson feared that losing Vietnam would embolden the Soviet Union and China, and damage America's credibility as the defender of the free world. He was haunted by the memory of appeasement in the 1930s, convinced that if the U.S. did not stand firm, communism would spread unchecked. And so, the president approved a series of air strikes against North Vietnam. The campaign was given a name, Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive, sustained bombing effort designed to cripple Hanoi's ability to wage war. Beginning in March 1965, American aircraft unleashed destruction on a scale Vietnam had never seen. Bridges, railways, supply depots, and power plants were struck again and again. In theory, the bombings would force North Vietnam to negotiate. In practice, they only deepened its resolve. For every bridge destroyed, new ones were built by hand. For every convoy lost, fresh supplies moved by night along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Civilians fled to bomb shelters, farmers dug new fields, and the war became a test of endurance rather than technology. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh told his people, "We will fight, we will rebuild, and we will fight again." The North's strategy was simple: bleed the enemy until his will to fight collapsed, just as they had done with the French. Back in Washington, Johnson's advisors debated numbers, strategies, and timelines. But one question went largely unasked: could victory in Vietnam even be defined? Military commanders requested more troops, more air power, more resources. Each time, the answer was yes. On March 8, 1965, 2 battalions of U.S. Marines, nearly 3,500 men, landed at Da Nang. Officially, they were there to protect the air base. Unofficially, America had entered the war. As the Marines stepped ashore, cameras rolled. Reporters captured smiling soldiers handing out candy to children, posing for photographs beside their gear. Back home, the images were broadcast as evidence of resolve and righteousness, America answering the call to defend freedom. Few realized that the landing marked the beginning of a war that would last a decade, claim millions of lives, and divide a nation. In the months that followed, troop numbers grew rapidly. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 American soldiers were stationed in Vietnam. Air bases expanded, supply lines stretched across the Pacific, and entire new command structures were built almost overnight. But the enemy refused to fight the kind of war America expected. There were no front lines, no decisive battles, no clear victories. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces struck, vanished, and reappeared elsewhere. Every village was a potential battlefield, every civilian a possible ally or spy. U.S. commanders measured success not in territory gained, but in body counts. War became arithmetic, a grim tally of the dead. Helicopters carried soldiers into firefights by day and the wounded out by night. Each victory seemed hollow, each promise of progress soon undone. To the American public, the war was still distant, framed by confident speeches and patriotic rhetoric. Television footage showed brave young men in the tropics, smiling for the camera. But to those on the ground, soldiers trudging through jungles and villages, never seeing the enemy, the reality was confusion and exhaustion. And for the Vietnamese people, North and South alike, it was a nightmare reborn. Bombs fell from the sky, homes burned once more, and the dream of independence turned again to survival. By the end of 1965, the die was cast. America was now fully committed. What began as a distant advisory mission had become a full-scale war. Each side was certain of its righteousness, and neither understood the other. For Washington, Vietnam was a test of will. For Hanoi, it was a test of existence. For the Vietnamese people caught between them, it was the price of history repeating itself. The world watched as one of the most powerful nations in history marched into a land of rice fields and rivers, determined to win a war that could not be measured in territory or treaties. Next, 1968. The year when the illusion of victory would shatter, and the Vietnam War would reveal its true cost. By the end of 1965, Vietnam was no longer a divided nation in crisis, it was a battlefield for the world's great powers. The French were gone. In their place stood the United States, armed, confident, and determined to succeed where empire had failed. But in the jungles and rice paddies, another story was being written, one of endurance, sacrifice, and quiet defiance. For every village destroyed, another would rebuild. For every soldier lost, another would rise. And for every victory claimed, the war's true cost grew heavier. The Americans came with helicopters, jet bombers, and boundless faith in technology. The Vietnamese fought with patience, cunning, and an unyielding belief that history was on their side. Neither fully understood the other, and neither would emerge unchanged. What began as a colonial rebellion had become a global confrontation. And as 1968 approached, the world would watch in horror and disbelief as the conflict reached its breaking point, a single offensive that shattered illusions, toppled leaders, and forever altered the course of the Vietnam War. This was only the beginning.